In the grand expanse of ancient Rome, where power flowed like the very rivers that ran through the empire, there was a young boy whose life would be torn apart by the whims of the most notorious emperor in history. Sporus, a 14-year-old boy, was born into the lap of privilege, the son of a prosperous merchant named Marcus Flavius. His family, one of respect and wealth, owned shops in 3 districts of Rome and a villa on the city's picturesque hills. His future seemed secure, filled with the promise of education, status, and a marriage to a girl from one of the most prestigious senatorial families. Sporus was everything that a Roman youth could hope to be: well-educated, groomed for success, and cherished by his family. Yet, it was his beauty that would become both his gift and his curse. His golden hair, fair skin, delicate features, and striking blue eyes, so rare in the Mediterranean world, made him a living sculpture, admired and even worshipped in the streets of Rome. Poets would write verses about him, artists would marvel at his physical perfection, and every Roman who saw him would pause, drawn to his youthful beauty. But beauty, in the world of emperors and tyrants, was a dangerous weapon. In March of 64 AD, Sporus found himself unknowingly thrust into the middle of a spectacle that would mark the beginning of his descent into a nightmare. During the Juvenalia festival, an event orchestrated by Emperor Nero, aristocratic youths would perform for the emperor. Sporus participated, showcasing a scene of dramatic art. This seemingly innocent performance would forever alter his fate. When Nero laid eyes on Sporus for the first time, the emperor's reaction was immediate and unrelenting. According to witnesses, Nero was consumed by lust. He whispered vile comments to his courtiers as he stared intently at the young boy, his gaze predatory and devoid of mercy. The sight of Sporus, like an angelic figure, ignited something deep within the emperor, something both perverse and all-consuming. That very night, Sporus's life would change forever. Imperial guards arrived at his family's home with an order from the emperor. Sporus was to come to the palace the following day for a discussion about his future. His father, Marcus Flavius, knew well the reputation of Nero, and although he tried to resist, offering vast sums of money to secure his son's freedom, it was clear that Nero had already made up his mind. Sporus was summoned, and his father's wealth and status were no match for Nero's decree. The next day, dressed in his finest toga, Sporus arrived at the palace, accompanied by his father. They were immediately separated. Marcus Flavius was told that his son would remain at the palace indefinitely to, quote, serve the interests of the empire. His sentence, disguised as honor, was nothing short of a death sentence. He would never see his son again. Sporus was taken to Nero's private chambers. What awaited him there was not merely an imperial indulgence, it was a nightmare. Nero did not simply want a new plaything for his twisted pleasures. He sought something much more grotesque. Nero's obsession with beauty, particularly the beauty of his late wife, Poppaea Sabina, had reached dangerous levels. Sporus, with his golden hair and delicate features, was the spitting image of the woman Nero had lost. In Nero's sickened mind, Sporus became not just a reflection of Poppaea, but her perfect, controllable version, a woman who would never betray him, never leave him. What followed was a fate worse than death. Sporus would soon discover that his beauty had not been a blessing, but a curse, and Nero, in his madness, would do everything in his power to remake Sporus into the image of his lost love, no matter the cost. The initial days of Sporus's captivity were not immediately brutal, at least not in the ways one might expect. Nero, in his obsession, did not resort to violence right away. Instead, he lavished Sporus with luxurious gifts, fine clothing, rich food, and a seemingly respectful treatment that bordered on courtly admiration. The boy, still in disbelief, wondered if perhaps this strange turn of events might not be as terrible as he had feared. Nero would often visit him, speaking of art, poetry, and philosophy, delighting in their conversations. For a time, it appeared that Sporus was not much more than a pawn in a bizarre royal fantasy, a mere object of beauty meant to entertain the emperor's whims. But this fleeting illusion of kindness was nothing more than a thin veil covering the nightmare that was about to unfold. As the days passed, Sporus began to realize that his fate was no longer his own. The grandeur of the emperor's palace, once a symbol of his own family's aspirations, had now become his prison. Nero's obsession with his dead wife, Poppaea Sabina, was not merely a passing grief. It was a deep psychotic fixation that would cost Sporus everything. The loss of Poppaea, whom Nero had loved with a fervor that bordered on madness, had shattered him in ways no one could understand. She was the one woman who had controlled him, who had tamed the emperor's volatile temper and molded him into a figure of imperial power. When Poppaea died under brutal circumstances, Nero's violent outburst, a kick to her pregnant belly that caused a fatal miscarriage, his grief was less about the loss of a partner and more about the loss of the object of his obsession. In his deranged mind, her death left a void that could not be filled by any other woman. Her beauty, her intellect, and her commanding presence had made her irreplaceable, yet Nero could not bear the thought of moving on. He was consumed by the idea of finding a way to recreate her, a quest that would lead him to Sporus. It was not the death of Poppaea alone that drove Nero to this monstrous decision. The emperor, after all, had always been deeply obsessed with beauty, particularly the beauty of young men and women who fit his ideals. Sporus, with his striking resemblance to Poppaea, became the embodiment of his wife's perfection. This resemblance was both a gift and a curse for the boy. Nero, in his obsession, could not merely mourn Poppaea's death. He sought to bring her back in a form that would never betray him, a form that he could control completely. Nero had a plan. His ultimate goal was to create a substitute for Poppaea, someone who could never escape him, someone who could never age, never change, and never refuse him. Sporus's beauty, once a source of admiration, was now twisted into a means to satisfy Nero's delusional need to resurrect his dead wife. It was in this sickened state that Nero turned his gaze upon Sporus and decided that the boy would become the physical manifestation of Poppaea. What followed was not the gentle coaxing of a ruler trying to replace a wife, but the systematic destruction of Sporus's identity. Nero did not simply want a living replica of Poppaea. He wanted to control every aspect of Sporus's being, from his appearance to his behavior, from his personality to his very soul. And so, the boy was molded into something neither man nor woman, a tragic simulacrum of the woman Nero had once loved. Nero's obsession soon reached terrifying proportions. It was not enough to merely admire Sporus from afar or dress him in garments that resembled Poppaea's. No, Nero wanted a more complete transformation. He wanted Sporus to become a living, breathing version of his late wife, someone who could never leave him, never grow old, and most horrifying of all, someone who would always be there to fulfill his twisted desires. The first moment that truly shattered Sporus's innocence came when his father, Marcus Flavius, was told that he would never see his son again. As he stood in the opulent, gilded halls of Nero's palace, the realization that his life would never be the same washed over him. The guards that accompanied him were not there to ensure Sporus's safety or escort him to a position of honor. They were there to take him from his family and strip him of his very identity. Despite Marcus Flavius's wealth and power, his pleas to spare his son from this fate fell on deaf ears. He offered vast sums of money, more than enough to sway any official or even the emperor himself. But Nero had already made his decision, and there was no bargaining with the emperor. The guards laughed at Marcus's offers, dismissing him as a powerless father in the face of imperial will. The next day, Sporus was separated from his father and taken into the heart of the imperial palace. a place where only the emperor's whim and desire reigned supreme. It was not long before he realized that the palatial luxury and refinement that seemed to surround him were merely the gilded bars of his new prison. Once a free boy with a promising future, he was now a living object, a plaything in the hands of a mad emperor. He was no longer Sporus, son of Marcus Flavius. He was an object to fulfill Nero's twisted fantasies. The emperor's first step in transforming Sporus into a replacement for Poppaea was not to physically change him, yet. Instead, it began with the soft power of manipulation. Nero spoke to him kindly at first, often treating him to meals and fine clothes, playing the part of the gracious ruler. He spoke of art, philosophy, and Roman values, drawing the young boy into conversations that seemed to promise some form of intellectual engagement. For a fleeting moment, Sporus might have thought that he was in the presence of a great ruler, one who appreciated his beauty, yes, but also respected his intellect. But these days of kindness were nothing more than a temporary distraction, an illusion. Nero, as manipulative as he was mad, understood the psychology of seduction well. He knew that by creating a veneer of gentleness, he could draw Sporus into his orbit, making the inevitable destruction of the boy's identity all the more excruciating when it eventually came. As the days turned into weeks, Sporus began to feel the weight of his captivity. The luxuries, once a balm for his fear, could no longer mask the horror of his situation. The realization that he would never leave the palace, never return to the family and life he had known, slowly began to dawn on him. His future was no longer a matter of ambition and hope, but one of survival. Nero's delusions about Sporus went far beyond simply possessing his beauty. The emperor, in the midst of his profound grief over Poppaea's death, had fixated on the idea of recreating her, not just as a woman, but as an ideal that could never fade or grow old. The starkest manifestation of this obsession was Nero's decision to transform Sporus into a physical replica of Poppaea. This transformation, however, would be no simple cosmetic alteration. Sporus was not merely to be dressed in the finery of Poppaea, he was to be physically changed, molded into the image of the woman who had once ruled his heart. Nero's plan was to castrate Sporus, effectively removing any trace of his former masculinity and, in doing so, erasing any remnants of his previous identity. The implications of such a transformation were far more than physical. It was a complete annihilation of Sporus's very essence, his selfhood, his autonomy, his future. Sporus was not just to become a replica of Nero's dead wife. He was to be a vessel into which Nero could pour all his grief, obsession, and desires. At this point, Sporus's fate had already been sealed. There was no escape, no negotiation, no turning back. He had become the victim of Nero's madness, the plaything of a tyrant who had lost touch with reality. The palace, with its marble floors and golden columns, had become a prison, and Sporus was its captive, held not by chains of iron, but by chains of the mind and body. Sporus's transformation into the object of Nero's delusional obsession was not just a cruel whim, it was the culmination of the emperor's descent into madness. Nero's need for control, for the total dominance of those around him, would now extend to the physical, psychological, and emotional destruction of Sporus. And Sporus, now entirely under the emperor's thumb, would be forced to live out the darkest fantasy of the most powerful man in the world. The day Sporus entered Nero's inner sanctum was the day his life was irrevocably altered. He was not simply a young boy in a gilded palace, surrounded by wealth and luxury. He had become the object of a terrifying obsession, but the worst of it was yet to come. Nero's plan to transform Sporus into a living, breathing version of his deceased wife, Poppaea, began with a plan so horrifically precise that it shocked even those within the imperial court who had grown accustomed to the emperor's excesses. The emperor's vision for Sporus was not just a physical transformation. but a mental and spiritual obliteration. What he sought was not merely the body of Poppaea, but the very soul of the woman who had once captivated him, an object to possess, to control, and to never let go. Sporus' first real encounter with this nightmare came when he was summoned to Nero's private chambers. There, he learned the true horror of what was about to happen. The emperor's madness had reached its peak, and he had already devised the means to bring his delusional fantasy to life. Sporus was no longer a boy. He was a tool in Nero's sickened hands, an unwilling participant in the emperor's bizarre plan to resurrect Poppaea. Nero, in his twisted obsession, did not want just any physical resemblance to Poppaea. He wanted a perfect replica, one that could not only mimic her beauty, but also embody her femininity in every sense. This required an extreme transformation, one that would forever erase Sporus' manhood. Nero, in his desperation to have Poppaea back, ordered Sporus to undergo castration. The procedure, led by Galen of Pergamon, the most famous surgeon in the Roman Empire, was not just a simple act of mutilation. It was a grotesque and meticulously planned operation. The goal was not merely to remove Sporus' testicles and genitals, but to fashion a new body, one that could simulate the appearance of a woman, while also preserving the ability for sexual intercourse without causing death by infection. The surgery itself took place in Nero's chambers, which had been transformed into a sterile surgical space. Sporus, drugged with opium to dull the pain, was bound to a marble table, helpless and at the mercy of those who sought to fulfill Nero's vision. Galen and his assistants worked with ruthless precision, removing the parts of Sporus that made him a man. For hours, the surgery continued, and the emperor watched intently, his twisted fixation evident in his every gaze. Despite the anesthesia, Sporus remained conscious, feeling every agonizing moment of the procedure. His world, a world once filled with hope, family, and a future, now seemed to fade as his body was mutilated beyond recognition. The task was not merely physical, it was psychological. Sporus, in his broken state, felt himself becoming something he was never meant to be, an object of desire in the hands of a deranged ruler. The results of the surgery were far from just physical damage. Sporus' identity, his sense of self, was destroyed in that moment. No longer a boy, no longer a man, he was caught in the horrific space between genders, a living parody of his former self. He had been transformed into something that could never be whole again, something only intended to fulfill the emperor's sickening need for control. For weeks, Sporus endured the agony of recovery. The physical pain was excruciating, but it was the psychological toll that would prove the most devastating. Sporus' once strong identity was shattered. His body, now a hollow shell of its former self, seemed to reject the changes. Fever, infection, and delirium ravaged him, but he was kept alive to serve Nero's fantasy. During his recovery, Nero visited Sporus daily, bringing gifts, comforting words, and promises of eternal love. The emperor, so completely lost in his obsession with Poppaea, convinced himself that he was not torturing Sporus, but saving him from a life of obscurity. He spoke of how Sporus had become something more than human, something divine. In his mind, Nero was a savior, rescuing the boy from a common life and elevating him to the status of an immortal queen. But the reality was far more sinister. While Nero saw himself as the protector of Sporus, the young boy saw only the erosion of his humanity. Every day, the boy struggled with the trauma of what had been done to him, trying to reconcile the person he had once been with the figure he had become. The world he had known, filled with family, friends, and a bright future, was now distant and unrecognizable. The young boy, once adored for his beauty, was now an instrument of torment in Nero's hands. His innocence, his youth, had been completely destroyed, and in its place was a broken vessel, a mere echo of a man. His fate had been sealed, not by his own actions, but by the uncontrollable desires of a mad emperor who sought to recreate the past at any cost. The transformation of Sporus was only the beginning of the nightmare that would stretch for years. As he lay recovering from the gruesome procedure, still bound to the marble table of Nero's palace, the emperor's obsession reached new heights. Nero's desire to control every aspect of Sporus's existence was relentless. The young boy, now irreversibly altered both physically and psychologically, was no longer just a victim of circumstance. He had become a vessel for Nero's delusional fantasies. Sporus was kept under the emperor's watchful eye at all times. Nero's visits became more frequent, more personal. In his mind, he was not tormenting Sporus. He was saving him. He promised the boy a life of eternal luxury, a world where he would never be abandoned or forgotten. To Nero, this transformation was not a cruelty. It was an act of love, a way of keeping Poppaea with him forever. But for Sporus, there was no love in this twisted existence, only fear, pain, and the slow destruction of his identity. With the surgical process completed, the emperor now turned his attention to the next phase of the transformation, one that would force Sporus to become the living embodiment of his deceased wife. The boy's physical appearance was only part of the transformation. Nero's madness demanded that Sporus replicate Poppaea in every conceivable way. Nero's obsession with every minute detail of the deceased woman's life became all-consuming. The emperor sought to recreate the woman he had lost, not through a simple likeness, but through an obsessive, agonizing process of imitation. Nero ordered that Sporus be dressed in Poppaea's finest clothes, silk gowns, elaborate jewelry, and tiaras, each crafted to perfection. Every detail was scrutinized. The same perfumes, the same hairstyles, the same cosmetics that had once adorned Poppaea were now to be applied to Sporus. Every morning, Sporus would wake to find a team of servants, all dedicated to ensuring that every aspect of his appearance matched that of the woman he was meant to replace. But the physical changes were not enough for Nero. He demanded that Sporus learn how to walk like Poppaea, speak like Poppaea, laugh like Poppaea. The emperor hired the best tutors, those who had served Poppaea during her life, to instruct Sporus in the mannerisms of his late wife. Every gesture, every word, every movement was to be perfected, until Sporus could no longer distinguish himself from Poppaea. For Sporus, this constant effort to imitate another person, to strip away his own identity and become a mere shadow of the woman who had once captivated Nero, was psychologically destructive. He began to lose the sense of who he was. He was no longer Sporus, the son of Marcus Flavius. He was now Poppaea. Each day, Sporus was forced to perform in this grotesque imitation, to live out a fantasy that was never his own. Nero would sit by, watching the lessons with obsessive intensity, offering guidance and criticism as though he were sculpting a perfect statue. The young boy's spirit was crushed under the weight of these daily demands, and the strain began to show. This psychological torture was just as damaging as the physical abuse. Sporus was no longer allowed to make his own decisions or think for himself. His mind was reshaped, remade into an image of what Nero desired, an image of a woman that had never existed except in the emperor's fevered mind. His will was broken, and his very sense of self was being obliterated by this endless pursuit of perfection. He was no longer an individual, but a tool used to satisfy the deepest, darkest fantasies of a man who had lost all connection to reality. As the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, Sporus's mind fractured under the relentless pressure. He began to lose touch with his past. The boy who had once been free, the son of a merchant, now only remembered fragments of his former life. The life of luxury he had once known seemed as distant as a dream, fading with every passing day. What remained was a tortured soul, struggling to remember who he had once been. Yet Nero's obsession only grew stronger. It was not enough for Sporus to simply resemble Poppaea. He had to become her, completely and utterly. Nero's delusions reached their peak when he began forcing Sporus to participate in bizarre, staged reenactments of moments from his marriage to Poppaea. The emperor had meticulously documented every interaction with his late wife, every word spoken, every glance exchanged, every laugh shared, and now he demanded that Sporus reenact these moments with excruciating accuracy. The emperor would sit, eyes filled with a mixture of longing and madness, watching Sporus perform these scenes. When the boy faltered or failed to replicate a gesture or word perfectly, Nero would lash out, correcting him with cruel punishment. Each mistake was met with physical pain, burns, lashes, and harsh reprimands. This cruel performance was not just a way to sustain Nero's fantasy of resurrecting Poppaea. It was a means of keeping Sporus trapped in a world where his identity was no longer his own. Every day, Sporus was reminded that he was not a human being but a puppet in Nero's grotesque theater. The young boy's humanity was gradually replaced with a role he could never escape from, no matter how much he wanted to. Nero's obsession was all-consuming, and Sporus's transformation into the emperor's ideal woman, his Poppaea, had become a twisted cycle of imitation and destruction. The tragedy of Sporus was not only in the physical mutilation he had suffered, but in the complete obliteration of his true self. As the days and weeks passed, Nero's obsession with Sporus took on a darker and more disturbing form. What had begun as a twisted plan to recreate Poppaea had now spiraled into a relentless cycle of abuse, both physical and sexual. Nero's delusions grew more intense, and his demands on Sporus escalated with every passing day. The emperor no longer saw Sporus as a boy, or even as a person. He had become an object, a living embodiment of his deceased wife, a thing that could be used, manipulated, and abused at will. The sexual abuse was horrific, but it was also part of a greater plan. Nero's plan to force Sporus into the role of a submissive woman. Nero's idea of love was twisted and deformed, a reflection of his profound psychological instability. For him, Sporus had become more than just a replacement for Poppaea. He had become a tool to fulfill his every depraved desire. Nero would visit Sporus daily, his behavior growing increasingly erratic. Sometimes he would speak sweetly to the boy, calling him "my dearest Poppaea," and promising him eternal love and devotion. Other times he would force Sporus into sexual acts, justifying them as a way to educate him in his new role as the emperor's wife. Nero was utterly convinced that these acts were part of the process of remaking Sporus into the perfect substitute for Poppaea, and he insisted on treating them as normal within the context of their relationship. The abuse took a toll on Sporus in ways that were difficult to comprehend. He was no longer allowed to retain any semblance of his own identity. His voice, once clear and strong, was now manipulated into a higher pitch to match the tone of Poppaea's voice. His physical body, once healthy and strong, was slowly being altered by the repeated abuse. Sporus's sense of self, who he was, what he had been, disappeared in the wake of Nero's obsessive desire to reshape him. But the sexual abuse was only the beginning of the emotional devastation that Sporus would face. In his mind, Nero had created an elaborate fantasy in which Sporus was not only his wife but his beloved Poppaea, reborn. But Sporus was no longer a man, nor a boy. He was a shell, an empty vessel meant only to fulfill Nero's every wish. And as his own sense of self was destroyed, Sporus began to spiral into a deep and consuming despair. Nero's cruelty knew no bounds. Each day, Sporus was subjected to a barrage of psychological torment. He was forced to reenact intimate moments with Poppaea, repeating words and actions that had once been shared between them, while Nero watched, satisfied by the sickening mimicry. The emperor's laughter, twisted and hollow, echoed through the chambers as he watched his Poppaea behave as he wished. But the emotional toll was unbearable. Sporus, once a free and joyful boy, had become a hollow shell, a mere reflection of a woman who had once lived in Nero's obsessive fantasies. The boy had lost his sense of self, his identity, and his humanity in a way that was both heartbreaking and terrifying. The emotional damage was irreversible, leaving Sporus unable to distinguish reality from the madness that had taken hold of his life. He began to lose himself in his roles, unable to separate the person he had once been from the person he was being forced to become. As Nero's obsession with Sporus deepened, the emperor's delusions took on even more horrifying dimensions. It was no longer enough for Sporus to simply resemble Poppaea in appearance and mannerisms. Nero wanted to make Sporus the living embodiment of his late wife, not just in the private chambers of the imperial palace, but in the eyes of the entire world. In his twisted mind, he sought to, quote, legitimize Sporus as his wife, as Poppaea reborn, through a grand public display. And so Nero began to plan the most grotesque and perverse ceremony in Roman history, a public marriage between himself and Sporus. This would not be a simple private affair. It would be a massive spectacle, attended by the most powerful figures in Rome. It was a declaration to the world that Nero had found his perfect wife once again, and that his power could remake the very laws of nature. This marriage would serve as a public statement of Nero's unchecked authority, an assertion that the emperor could do anything, even defy nature itself. The preparations for the marriage were elaborate. Nero demanded that artisans create a replica of Poppaea's wedding dress, a masterpiece of silk and gold thread that had cost more than most Roman villas. The tiara that Poppaea had worn on their wedding day was recreated with stunning detail, its diamonds and emeralds reflecting the madness that had taken root in Nero's soul. Even the flowers used in the ceremony were chosen to replicate those used in Poppaea's own wedding, a sickening attempt to resurrect the past. As the day of the wedding approached, Sporus was forced to undergo more training, more lessons, in order to become the perfect Poppaea for Nero. He was dressed in the wedding gown, the tiara placed upon his head, and the attendants meticulously ensured that every detail of his appearance matched the late empress's. Sporus, now broken both physically and mentally, was little more than a puppet in this grotesque charade. He had no say in the matter, no voice in the decision that would define his fate. The emperor had already decided that Sporus would become Poppaea, and the rest of the world would be forced to witness this twisted union. The day of the ceremony arrived, and the guests were summoned to the imperial gardens. It was a lavish event, filled with Roman senators, generals, dignitaries from foreign lands, all the important figures of Roman society. But there was an air of discomfort among the attendees. The grandeur of the occasion was marred by a sense of unease. The guests, who had seen their fair share of imperial excess, were stunned into silence when they realized the true nature of the event. Nero was not marrying a woman. He was marrying a boy. His mutilated, castrated servant, dressed as his dead wife. The ceremony itself was a grotesque spectacle. Nero, standing proudly in his imperial regalia, turned to Sporus, calling him by the name of Poppaea. With a sickening grin, he forced Sporus to play along, responding as though he were the wife Nero had lost. The marriage vows were spoken, not with love, but with a chilling sense of domination. Nero insisted that Sporus speak the words, that he behave as though he were truly Poppaea, all while the emperor watched with a twisted sense of satisfaction. For Sporus, the ceremony was a nightmarish mockery of everything he had once known. He was forced to play a role he could never escape from, trapped in a living nightmare. And while the ceremony was a spectacle to the emperor, it was a horrific, dehumanizing event for the boy. It was a marriage in name only, a symbol of Nero's power over life, death, and identity. But for Sporus, it was the final stage in the complete obliteration of his humanity. The marriage between Nero and Sporus was not only a personal tragedy for the boy, it was a public spectacle that shocked the entire Roman elite. As the ceremony unfolded, the atmosphere was one of horror and disbelief. The guests, many of them influential figures in the Roman Empire, were forced to watch in stunned silence as Nero's delusions took center stage. Sporus, dressed in the wedding gown of Poppaea, looked every bit the part of the emperor's wife. Yet his face, pale and filled with terror, betrayed the true horror of what was taking place. Nero, oblivious to the suffering of his bride, smiled with twisted satisfaction, convinced that he had found the perfect substitute for his lost love. The emperor's eyes gleamed with manic obsession as he led Sporus through the mock ceremony, whispering sweet nothings as though he were truly marrying the woman he had once adored. The cruelty of the spectacle was not lost on those who had gathered to witness it. Some guests recoiled in disgust, unable to believe what they were seeing. Others, more politically astute, understood that to express any disapproval would be to risk their own lives. Nero's power, though now tainted by madness, was still absolute. And so, the guests remained silent, watching as the emperor forced his delusions upon the young boy who had once been free. The most chilling moment of the ceremony came when Nero, in a moment of unhinged joy, kissed Sporus on the lips, proclaiming loudly for all to hear, "Finally, my beloved has returned to me." He called Sporus Poppaea, speaking to him as though he were truly his wife reborn. For the witnesses, the scene was one of sheer horror. An emperor, once a symbol of power and might, now reduced to a grotesque figure playing out his sick fantasies on a helpless boy. The public spectacle of the wedding was over, but for Sporus, the nightmare had only just begun. While the world had witnessed the grotesque farce and seen Nero's delusional quest to resurrect his late wife, the real horror was still unfolding in the private chambers of the emperor. Nero's actions were no longer confined to the theatrical. They now became a constant, all-encompassing torment that Sporus could never escape. For Sporus, there was no relief. The emperor had created a reality where his mind no longer belonged to him, where he was Poppaea and nothing else. After the public ceremony, Sporus was forced to live out this delusion every single day. Nero made him wear Poppaea's dresses, jewelry, and perfumes, as though he were an exact replica of the woman who had once held his heart. Every morning, Sporus would awaken to the same routine, a team of servants ensuring that he looked, acted, and behaved exactly like the woman he could never be. But it was the emotional and psychological toll of these demands that proved to be the most damaging. Nero expected Sporus to be more than just a physical stand-in for Poppaea. He required him to replicate every minute detail of her existence, down to the smallest gestures. Sporus was forced to memorize every mannerism, every word, every action that had once been associated with Poppaea. He was trained to laugh in a particular way, to speak with the same intonation, to even move as Poppaea had. Every mistake in this performance was met with Nero's furious punishment, further eroding Sporus' sense of self. Nero's obsession grew more and more consuming. He no longer saw Sporus as a person, but as a mere extension of his own desires. Every action, every word that Sporus spoke was now dictated by Nero's unhinged fantasies. What had once been a young boy's life of potential and promise was now reduced to an endless cycle of mimicry and suffering. Despite the outward appearances of wealth and privilege, Sporus lived a life that was nothing more than a gilded cage. His body had been altered, his mind was slipping away, and his spirit was crushed under the weight of Nero's delusions. He was no longer Sporus, the son of a Roman merchant. He had become a puppet, an object of Nero's obsession, and an unwilling player in the emperor's warped fantasy of resurrection. Sporus's days were spent living in constant fear, not of death, but of breaking the emperor's fragile illusion. The smallest deviation from his role as Poppaea would result in punishment, and Nero's wrath was terrifying. What was left of Sporus's identity continued to disintegrate, replaced by a version of Poppaea that was nothing but a ghost, an ideal that existed only in Nero's disturbed mind. The collapse of Nero's empire and the death of the emperor by his own hand marked the end of an era of terror. But for Sporus, the nightmare continued even after Nero's death. Nero's fall from power brought about a brief moment of respite for Sporus, but the toll that the emperor's cruelty had taken on him was irreversible. He had been left a broken man, physically and psychologically scarred beyond recognition. After Nero's death, the new emperor Galba took power. He recognized the significance of Sporus not as a victim, but as a living reminder of the depravity that had occurred under Nero's reign. Galba, in his attempt to distance himself from Nero's legacy, sought to keep Sporus alive as a symbol of the madness that had plagued the imperial court. However, it was clear that Sporus's mind had been destroyed by years of abuse. The new regime, although eager to move away from the horrors of Nero's reign, could not erase the damage done to Sporus. His mind had fractured into multiple personalities, and he had become a living example of what unchecked power and cruelty could do to a human soul. Sporus's existence became a quiet symbol of the dangers of absolute power. His torment was not only the result of Nero's actions, but also the result of a system that allowed such horrors to take place unchecked. As a victim of the emperor's tyranny, Sporus was the embodiment of the cost of power without morality. In the final months of his life, Sporus's existence was a shell, drifting between lucidity and delirium. The boy who had once dreamed of a future with his family, the boy who had been admired for his beauty, was now a broken man, his soul consumed by the horrors he had endured. In December of 68 AD, Sporus took his own life. After years of unspeakable torment, he chose to end the suffering, his final act of defiance against the life that had been forced upon him. His death, though a quiet and private affair, was the final chapter in a tragedy that had begun with the emperor's obsession and ended with the complete destruction of a human being. Sporus's story, while often forgotten by the wider narrative of history, stands as a somber reminder of the horrors that power and obsession can bring. It is a tragic tale of a boy who was torn apart by the very forces that should have protected him. His death, the result of years of suffering, serves as a final statement on the price of absolute power. Sporus's story, though largely forgotten by the annals of mainstream history, continues to echo as a haunting reminder of the dangers of unchecked power. His life, marked by tragedy and unimaginable suffering, is a stark example of how absolute power can corrupt not only rulers, but also the lives of innocent people caught in the web of tyrannical obsession. Sporus, once a free boy full of hope and promise, had been reduced to a mere object in Nero's delusional world, a tool to fulfill the emperor's sick fantasies. The tragedy of Sporus's existence serves as a profound warning about the fragility of humanity when subjected to cruelty, control, and power. Sporus's name may not be as widely recognized as other figures from ancient history, but his life offers us an essential lesson. The dehumanizing effects of tyranny can have lasting consequences on both the victim and society at large. Despite the efforts to bury his story, it survived through the accounts of witnesses, including slaves, servants, and medical professionals who saw the horror firsthand. Writers like Suetonius recorded fragments of Sporus's ordeal, documenting his suffering as part of the larger narrative of Nero's depravity. Through these accounts, we glimpse the true cost of absolute power and the horrific toll it takes on those who fall prey to it. The legacy of Sporus, therefore, is not just about his own suffering, but also about the broader impact of such tyranny on the world around him. His tragic fate serves as a reflection of the power dynamics that have existed throughout history. Sporus represents the millions of nameless victims, both throughout history and in the modern world, who have suffered at the hands of those who hold power without accountability. In a world that often turns a blind eye to the suffering of the powerless, Sporus' legacy stands as a reminder of the importance of empathy, justice, and the need to protect the vulnerable from those who would seek to exploit them. His story, though marked by brutality, also represents the strength of the human spirit. Sporus' tragic life and eventual death serves as an enduring call to action for those who believe in the preservation of human dignity and the fight against cruelty in all its forms. It is crucial that we remember Sporus, not just as a victim, but as a symbol of the price that is paid when power is abused without limits. His story should not be forgotten. It must remain a part of our collective consciousness to remind us that we must remain vigilant against those who would seek to erase the humanity of others for their own selfish desires. Sporus' death, though an end to his suffering, was also a final, devastating victory for Nero. The emperor had completely obliterated Sporus' identity, destroying his mind, body, and spirit. But in his final act of defiance, when he chose to end his life, Sporus asserted control over one aspect of his existence: his choice to escape the horrors of the life that had been imposed upon him. In the aftermath of Nero's reign, as Rome moved forward in the wake of his tyranny, Sporus' story was largely silenced, swept under the rug of imperial politics. However, his suffering did not go unnoticed, nor did it fade entirely from the historical record. Sporus stands as a testament to the enduring legacy of oppression, and his memory should be preserved, not just as a reminder of the depths of human cruelty, but as a call to prevent such abuses from ever occurring again. The story of Sporus reminds us of the fragility of the human spirit and the need to protect the vulnerable, ensuring that no one is subjected to such unimaginable torment. His legacy, though tragic, is an essential piece of history that we must continue to honor and reflect upon. As the power dynamics of Rome shifted following Nero's death, Sporus' existence became a symbol of the excesses and horrors of the imperial system. The political landscape of Rome had been altered forever, and the wounds left by Nero's reign were deep. While the new emperor Galba sought to distance himself from Nero's legacy, he could not escape the reminder that Sporus represented. Sporus, who had once been a young boy full of promise, now stood as a living testament to the madness that had gripped the empire. His transformation into the living embodiment of Poppaea, his abuse at the hands of Nero, and the complete obliteration of his identity were now a dark chapter in the history of the Roman Empire. Galba, as the new emperor, recognized that Sporus' continued existence would only serve to remind the people of the horrors of the previous regime. His life, if left in the public eye, could stir up discontent and distrust in the new emperor. So Galba made the decision to keep Sporus hidden away, far from the eyes of the Roman populace. Sporus, now a broken figure, was kept in isolation, away from the court and the public eye. His fate was sealed, not by any fault of his own, but because he had been the victim of a power structure that had failed him in every way. In the broader political context, Sporus' story became a symbol not only of Nero's depravity, but also of the cost of the imperial system itself. His existence, once a bright promise of youth, had been snuffed out by the whims of a mad emperor. In the shifting tides of Roman politics, Sporus' presence served as a reminder of the corrupting influence of absolute power and the devastating impact it had on those who lived under it. After Nero's death, the Roman authorities did everything in their power to erase the legacy of his reign. Sporus, as one of the most visible victims of Nero's madness, was swept under the rug of imperial history. The new rulers, including Galba, sought to distance themselves from Nero's excesses by obscuring the memories of those who had suffered under his tyrannical rule. Sporus' story, though passed down through the accounts of those who had witnessed his suffering, was deliberately hidden from public view. The Roman elite, eager to move on from the horrors of Nero's reign, chose to bury the truth of Sporus' fate, choosing instead to focus on rebuilding the empire and maintaining the status quo. His life, marked by brutality and loss, was relegated to the shadows, far from the public eye. Yet, despite the efforts to erase his story, the legacy of Sporus endured. His suffering was documented by those who had witnessed the horrors he endured. Writers like Suetonius, though they did not dwell extensively on his life, recorded fragments of his existence. These fragments, though sparse, ensured that Sporus' memory survived, even if only in bits and pieces. His story, though largely forgotten by the masses, was preserved through the accounts of those who had seen the depravity firsthand. The silence that surrounded Sporus' life is a reflection of the broader societal tendency to overlook the suffering of the powerless. In the aftermath of Nero's reign, Rome sought to bury the evidence of the emperor's cruelty. The story of Sporus, though it would never be fully erased, became one of the many dark chapters of Roman history that was deliberately ignored or minimized. His legacy, however, would survive, not in the grand halls of the empire, but in the hearts of those who recognized the true cost of absolute power. Sporus' life serves as a reminder that history often erases the voices of the most vulnerable. His suffering, though hidden by the Roman authorities, is a testament to the ways in which societies fail to protect those who are most at risk. In the years that followed Nero's death, Sporus' story became a quiet, haunting symbol of the abuse of power, one that would resurface only in whispers, carried by the winds of history. Sporus' life, if it could even be called that anymore, became a continuous cycle of torment. The world outside of Nero's palace continued, indifferent to his suffering. But for Sporus, the walls of the emperor's domain were both a prison and a nightmare he could never escape. Each day, he was forced to perform in this twisted play of resurrection, embodying the very woman who had once been Nero's obsession, his dead wife, Poppaea. The pain Sporus endured was not only physical, but deeply psychological. Nero's repeated abuse, sexual, emotional, and psychological, left him broken in ways that no one could fully comprehend. Sporus was no longer the vibrant boy who had once dreamed of a future with his family. He had become a living shadow, trapped in a role that destroyed his humanity. But it was the daily rituals of abuse that became the most soul-crushing. Nero demanded that Sporus undergo constant training to ensure that his behavior matched the perfection of Poppaea. He would be forced to sit in front of a mirror for hours, observing his own reflection as though he were not a human being but a doll being molded into a woman's likeness. Nero's sickening obsession with perfection was evident in every detail. If Sporus moved too quickly, too slowly, or failed to mimic the exact posture of Poppaea, Nero would lash out in anger. The punishment for breaking character was swift and brutal. Nero's temper would flare, and the emperor would call upon his guards to administer the consequences. These punishments, though often physical in nature, were always deeply humiliating. Sporus, once a free boy with dreams of the future, was now reduced to a mere tool for Nero's sick fantasies, a puppet in a macabre play. As time passed, Sporus became more and more a shell of his former self. He no longer recognized the boy who had once been full of hope and vitality. The boy who had once walked freely in the streets of Rome, admired for his beauty and intelligence, was now gone, replaced by a broken, hollow imitation. The transformation was not just physical, it was emotional, psychological, and spiritual. Sporus had lost his identity in this ongoing process of metamorphosis. His very sense of who he was had been obliterated, replaced by the emperor's obsessive need to remake his wife through him. Sporus no longer had a voice in the matter. He had become a living expression of Nero's sick need for control, a plaything in the hands of a mad emperor. Even in his darkest moments, Sporus could not escape the torment of his existence. The mere act of trying to resist, even mentally, would result in further abuse. It became a game of survival, one that Sporus was slowly losing. His mind, once sharp and filled with the possibility of a bright future, was now slipping away into madness. The constant strain of living as a substitute for Poppaea, a woman who had once lived and loved, had broken his spirit. Sporus's life was now one long act of survival. Each day he was forced to relive the worst moments of his life. His soul, his humanity, were being stripped away, piece by piece, until nothing remained but a body that Nero could control. The boy who had once known love, family, and hope had been consumed by the emperor's twisted obsession. In the depths of his madness, Nero decided that the illusion of Poppaea's life could not be complete without one final, grotesque addition. The emperor, in his twisted view of reality, believed that Poppaea had been pregnant at the time of her death. In his disturbed mind, this pregnancy had to be, quote, reborn. But there was one problem. The woman he had sought to resurrect had been dead for months. So in typical Nero fashion, he sought to create a simulated pregnancy, a mockery of life itself, using Sporus as the vessel for this delusion. The procedure to create a pregnant Sporus was both bizarre and cruel. Nero ordered that cushions be sewn into Sporus's clothing, making his stomach appear as though it were growing with a child. The boy, now completely subjugated to the emperor's will, was forced to act as though he were truly pregnant. He was told to mimic the behaviors of a pregnant woman, to have morning sickness, to experience cravings, and to show the emotional fluctuations that a mother-to-be would experience. Sporus's mind, already fractured by the abuse he had suffered, began to buckle under the strain of this new role. He was not allowed to live as a human being, nor was he permitted to exist as a man or a boy. He had to become something that did not exist, a pregnant version of a woman who had never been real. The emperor's delusions had taken on new forms, and Sporus had no choice but to comply, his survival depending on his ability to adhere to the emperor's fantasies. During these absurd sessions, Sporus would engage in conversations with the child in his belly, speaking to the phantom life that was growing inside him. He was told to sing lullabies and speak of the child's future as if it were truly alive. Nero would watch these sessions with tears in his eyes, convinced that he was witnessing the rebirth of his beloved Poppaea. He believed that in this bizarre mockery of maternity, he had created a future for himself, one that would live on forever. But the toll on Sporus was unimaginable. His mind, already fragmented by the physical and emotional abuse he had endured, began to deteriorate further. His sense of reality was warped beyond recognition. The young boy, once free, now believed that he was a woman, pregnant with a child that did not exist. The emperor's twisted fantasy had completely consumed him, and there was no escape. As if the simulated pregnancy was not enough to torment Sporus, Nero's delusions reached their final, most perverse stage. The emperor, convinced that he could resurrect Poppaea completely, decided that a birth was necessary. Sporus, still trapped in the role of a pregnant woman, was now forced to quote-quote give birth. The emperor ordered the creation of a mock birth, where Sporus would simulate labor and bring a child into the world. The procedure was excruciating, both physically and emotionally. Sporus was subjected to false contractions, the pain of which was made worse by the fact that there was no child to bring into the world. The entire event was a performance, a horrific charade that served only to deepen Sporus's descent into madness. Nero's expectation was that Sporus would emerge as a mother, not just to the child that was never born, but to a new role that would cement his place as Poppaea's perfect replacement. The physical toll was immense. Sporus, unable to escape the cruelty of the emperor's fantasies, gave birth to a doll, an inanimate object that represented the child Nero had imagined. The emperor, with tears in his eyes, embraced the doll as though it were his own flesh and blood, convinced that he had created a perfect family with Sporus as his wife and mother of his child. But for Sporus, this moment was the final destruction of his humanity. Forced to give birth to a lifeless object, he had no choice but to accept the role that Nero had crafted for him. He had become not just a substitute for Poppaea, but a mere vessel, a shell of a person drained of every ounce of individuality. The emperor's obsession had reached its zenith. Nero's cruelty had destroyed Sporus's identity, his sense of self, and his soul. What remained was a broken boy, trapped in a body that was not his own, living out the delusions of a madman who sought to recreate the past at any cost. As the world outside Nero's palace began to unravel, so too did the emperor's fragile grip on reality. The Roman Empire, once a beacon of power and might, now teetered on the edge of chaos. Revolts, conspiracies, and military uprisings threatened Nero's rule. The emperor, already steeped in delusions and paranoia, became increasingly unstable. And in his deteriorating mental state, he sought solace in the only thing he believed to be constant, his twisted relationship with Sporus. With every passing day, Nero's obsession with Sporus intensified. The emperor's paranoia reached new heights as he became convinced that the young boy was the only thing in his life that could offer him stability. Sporus, once a free boy with a family, had been reduced to nothing more than a symbol of Nero's deteriorating mind. The emperor saw in Sporus the idealized version of Poppaea, the woman he could never truly possess, and he believed that in Sporus he could hold on to his past and protect himself from the encroaching chaos. As Nero's political troubles deepened, he became more and more reliant on Sporus for emotional support. The emperor would drag Sporus with him to public meetings, military sessions, and Senate appearances, making the boy his constant companion. Sporus, shackled to the emperor in both body and mind, was forced to endure the psychological torment of Nero's increasingly erratic behavior in front of the Roman elite. The emperor's paranoid episodes became more frequent. He would accuse Sporus of collaborating with rebels, of secretly conspiring against him, simply because Sporus had failed to meet the emperor's delusional expectations of what Poppaea would have done. This constant psychological pressure was unbearable for Sporus, whose mind had already been broken by the emperor's cruel demands. Nero's mental deterioration only amplified the emotional and physical abuse he inflicted upon Sporus. The boy, already struggling to hold on to any semblance of his original identity, was now subjected to constant, unpredictable outbursts of Nero's wrath. The once vibrant boy who had lived in a world of opportunity now found himself entangled in the emperor's nightmare, unable to escape. And so, the Roman Empire, facing rebellion and civil unrest, had an emperor who had become a mere shell of a man, clinging to his delusions, dragging his broken victim with him into the abyss. Sporus, in his own broken state, was trapped in a relationship of twisted dependence, unable to escape the madness that surrounded him. As Nero's grip on the empire and his mind began to crumble, Sporus, in the midst of his degradation, found a brief glimmer of resistance. It was a moment of fleeting clarity, the first time in years that he attempted to break free from the psychological and physical prison that Nero had created for him. In the summer of 68 AD, as Nero fled the capital amidst the impending threat of rebellion, he took Sporus with him. The two sought refuge in a small, remote villa on the outskirts of Rome. For Sporus, this escape was a final opportunity, a final chance to reclaim some shred of control over his life. The villa, isolated and quiet, offered a momentary reprieve from Nero's madness. But it was in the solitude of this place that Sporus first considered the possibility of escape. For the first time in years, the young boy saw an opportunity to break free from the chains that bound him to Nero. He was no longer surrounded by the emperor's court, no longer under the watchful eye of imperial officials. The idea of freedom, of returning to the life he had once known, flooded Sporus's mind. However, Nero, always paranoid, was never far from Sporus's side. In the middle of the night, as Nero slept, Sporus made his move. Quietly, he crept to the kitchen, where he found a knife. For a brief moment, he thought of cutting the chains that bound him to the emperor, literally and metaphorically. His trembling hands grasped the knife, and he began to cut through the chains that held him to Nero. But Sporus's brief attempt at freedom was doomed to fail. The sound of the chains clinking alerted Nero, who awoke to find his beloved Poppaea attempting to escape. Nero's reaction was swift and brutal. In his rage, he accused Sporus of betraying him, of trying to flee and abandon him in his time of need. The attempt to break free, the small flicker of hope, was crushed by the emperor's fury. Nero bound Sporus to a tree and spent hours torturing him, convinced that the boy had betrayed him. It was during this punishment that Sporus's mental state, already fragile, began to break beyond repair. The small spark of resistance that had flared within him was extinguished by the fire of Nero's rage. For Sporus, escape was no longer a possibility. His mind, once capable of hope and action, was now destroyed by the emperor's cruelty. The attempt to escape was brief, but it marked the last time Sporus showed any form of resistance to Nero. In the end, Nero's complete domination of Sporus was solidified, body, mind, and soul. Sporus's broken attempt at freedom became a tragic symbol of the extent to which the emperor had destroyed him. As the Roman Empire plunged deeper into chaos, with rebellions and civil unrest threatening Nero's reign, the emperor's fixation on Sporus became his last remaining tether to any semblance of stability. Despite the political turmoil surrounding him, Nero clung to Sporus as though the boy were the last vestige of his former glory. The emperor, in his madness, believed that Sporus was the key to maintaining the image of power and control that he so desperately needed. Nero began to isolate Sporus further, keeping him chained not only to the emperor, but also to a world of perpetual suffering. The boy was no longer allowed to interact with anyone outside of Nero's immediate circle. He was kept in a state of complete dependence, unable to escape the emperor's obsessive control. During this period, Sporus's mental state deteriorated further. The trauma of the physical mutilation, the sexual abuse, the constant psychological torment, it all combined to leave him in a state of complete disassociation. Sporus no longer knew who he was, nor did he care. His identity had been so thoroughly erased that he had become nothing more than an extension of Nero's delusional world. But despite the emperor's deepening insanity, Nero's political fortunes began to falter. The rebellions against his rule became more widespread, and the emperor's grip on power weakened. As the situation grew more dire, Nero's paranoia reached new heights. He became increasingly convinced that everyone around him, including Sporus, was conspiring against him. The more he lashed out, the more his empire crumbled beneath him. Sporus, once a boy full of potential and promise, was now a broken shell, forced to play a role he had no control over. His suffering, though largely ignored by the outside world, had reached a level of unimaginable horror. He was the living representation of the emperor's madness, his punishment for Nero's insanity. The final days of Nero's reign were marked by escalating violence, both on the battlefield and within the palace walls. Sporus, now a mute figure of brokenness, was dragged through the final stages of Nero's madness. The emperor's paranoia led him to lash out even more violently at those closest to him, including Sporus, who was no longer capable of resistance. Nero's destruction of Sporus was complete, physically, emotionally, and mentally. The story of Sporus is not just a tale of personal tragedy. It is a reflection of the profound dangers of absolute power. Sporus, once a young boy with a promising future, became a victim of an emperor's unchecked desires and delusions. His life was torn apart by the whims of a tyrant, and his story serves as a dark reminder of the cost of power without accountability. Through Sporus's suffering, we are reminded of the vulnerability of those at the mercy of tyrants and the devastating impact of unchecked authority. The emperor's manipulation and abuse of Sporus are a stark reminder of how power can corrupt not only individuals, but entire systems. The dehumanization that Sporus endured is a testament to the worst excesses of imperial rule, where the lives of the powerless are disregarded in favor of the desires of those in power. As we reflect on Sporus's life, we are called to remember the dangers of tyranny and the importance of protecting the most vulnerable members of society. His story, though tragic, serves as a warning to us all. The destruction of Sporus's body, mind, and spirit is a consequence of a system that allowed such cruelty to go unchecked, and it is our responsibility to ensure that such horrors are never repeated. In the end, Sporus's legacy is one of tragedy, but also one of resilience. Despite the complete annihilation of his identity, despite the physical and psychological torment he endured, his story remains a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Sporus's life and death remind us that the price of absolute power is not just the destruction of one person, but the erosion of the very fabric of humanity itself. Sporus may have been silenced by history, but his story continues to echo through the centuries, reminding us of the fragility of human dignity and the enduring need for justice, compassion, and the protection of the vulnerable. His suffering serves as a cautionary tale, urging us to remain vigilant against the forces that seek to oppress, control, and destroy. The story of Sporus is one of unimaginable cruelty, but it serves as a powerful reminder of the devastating effects of unchecked power. His life, forever altered by the whims of an emperor, stands as a chilling symbol of how tyranny can strip away humanity itself. Thank you for watching. If this story has resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping historical tales. Your support helps us bring more forgotten histories to light. Stay tuned and join us next time as we uncover even more untold stories from the past.